All right, so again, Mr. Ware already initiated you into Imago Dei. I'm just going to we're going to go over that ourselves, me and you. Probably, I wanted to do it today, but we won't get to it till probably Monday. I'm sorry, I wanted to do it Friday, we won't get till Monday. But it's all underneath the understanding of the dignity of the human person. This is basic in morality. So many of the things that we'll be talking about is based in the dignity of each of us as individuals. So today we'll talk about God's plan, which is, sort of countercultural in itself to think that there actually is a plan for us. And then we'll talk briefly about our response. And then I will talk about just one creation myth, the Babylonian creation myth. We'll get into that shortly. All right. Now, this first slide really is just some bigger ideas. So whatever notes you want to glean, fine, but I'm just trying to lay out what happened. So here you have Michelangelo's fresco of the expulsion of Adam and Eve. All right. So this is an event. It's a game changer for us as a human people. So they were told, created in his image, they were told that they can eat from any of the trees in the garden except from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So they made a choice, basically in a sense, to determine what is goodness for themselves and what is evil for themselves. So they already were starting to see a falling away of objective truth. It's hard for us to understand what this means. So I want you, because we don't have a grand vision of covenant like, say, maybe the Jewish people would. They understand that they're in covenant with God. This was the first covenant, Adam and Eve, with the Father. So what does it mean to break a covenant? We don't have good examples, although we have one available to us. We just don't think of marriage in terms of covenant. All right? So a covenant really is an exchange of people. It's so different than a contract. All right? Contracts can be broken. Contracts have terms. Covenants, there's no escape clause. There's nothing out. There's no golden parachutes you're in. It's like jumping in the water as opposed to saying, I'll stick my foot in if I feel like it. So what happens is it's hard for us to wrap our minds around what's with the expulsion. What does a break of covenant mean? Well, this is the only thing we could probably really identify with is let's pretend 20 years from now that you've been married, say for, I don't know, say you're married for 10 years, 11 years, and then you find out your spouse has been cheating on you. They broke that covenant with you. That's what we're talking about here, writ large. So it's that even multiplied almost infinitely, right? So it's no little thing, these choices that we make, and it forms who we are as people. So what happens, though, is unlike what would be our reaction to a breach of covenant, say adultery, the Father's actions were quite different. So this is the proto-evangelium. Now, does anybody remember what proto-evangelium means?
First gospel?
Yeah, first gospel, but I'm going to say first good news, which is the same thing, right? But this is the first good news. So as soon as the covenant was breached with God, he then turns towards the serpent and he basically lays out what's going to happen. He says, I'm going to put enmity between your seed and her seed. You will snap at her heels, she will crush your head. So what this is telling us is that the first words out of God's mouth when the covenant with him was breached was, I'm going to restore the relationship between us. Now, I need you to think ahead in some fictional, tragedy. Could you imagine that you're married for 15, 20 years and you find out your spouse has been having an affair on you? Would the first words out of your mouth be, with my love, I will restore what you've damaged. I will restore this covenant between us. Look, I'm not asking you because I wouldn't. Those would not be the first words out of my mouth, right? I'd have all the reactions you would have, envy and and upset and feeling like an idiot and being mad. But the first words out of his mouth were, "Now I'm going to restore this." So I just got done teaching a course on Christian anthropology where I can expand on this idea over the course of 15 hours. I don't have that ability to do that with you. But we run into a series of covenants. And the whole Old Testament is a crescendo, right, to God restoring this. So you have him starting with this Adam and Eve, which is a covenant, and they break it, and then he starts to restore it, right? and then it gets up to Noah, and things get bad again, so he then destroys the world with a flood. That you can almost interpret that as a recreation, all right? Now he's in a covenant with a family, went from a couple to a family. And then eventually that wanes, and then he starts calling a people through Abraham. Now we're talking about a people. And then this is reinforced through the covenants he made with Moses, where now I'll give you my law. Now I'm going to start forming you. Okay? And then it goes into the kings, and then it goes into the prophets and the wisdom literature. And again, it gets very erotic. When you start reading the Songs of Solomon, it's very erotic. As a matter of fact, so much so that when John Paul II put out his book, that's typically known as Theology of the Body, although it's, God's love and the divine plan, he left out the reflections on the Songs of Solomon because they thought that it was a little bit too racy, their since being added in. John Paul II didn't think that, but other people did. So then you have this 2 centuries of silence and then the birth of Christ. All right? So the whole thing's like this crescendo of him bringing us back, even though it was entirely our choice out of it. So here we have the Annunciation, which is when God became incarnate, by the way. Christmas is the Nativity. The incarnation happened at the Feast of the Annunciation. And just as an aside, because I don't teach you guys scripture per se, have you ever heard the phrase, with God nothing is impossible? Have you heard that phrase? Okay, that's not what it says. And by the way, it comes from this moment of the Annunciation, because Mary's like, how is this possible since I did not know man? And what it literally says in the Greek, and it makes more sense then when you hear Mary's response, the angel says, with God, every word is possible. It's entirely in the positive. It's not nothing is impossible. It's with God, every word is possible. And then it makes sense when Mary responds then, let it be done to me then according to thy word. In other words, the whole thing fits. This is what's happening here. So at this time, and this is really cataclysmic. This is like a deity breaking in to the temporal. This is eternity breaking into, the finite. So from this moment on now, he says, I will come myself. I will then reveal to you what it means to be man. I will become man so I can reveal to you. What does that mean? Now again, there can be discussions as to, did Jesus become man because of the fall? Or was it always his intention? The Franciscans would always say, he always intended to become man. Now, in other words, this is such a beautiful thing. It can't, hinge on the fault of Adam and Eve. Of course, he came and died for our sins. That was the restoration. So, there could be flexibility because we don't have direct revelation on why exactly he became incarnate. But I like to side with the Franciscans, is that this was always from the beginning of time God's plan to extend his love and become the pinnacle of all creation. All right? So nonetheless, so just a few little tidbits about this. We image God. Like, what does that mean to image God? We'll talk about Imago Dei directly. But when we say image God in our actions of love and gift, it's also in our sexuality and our friendship. There's nothing outside of his purview. All right? So this is why Catholic morality, is really dependent on our understanding of sexuality. And sexuality, by the way, I'm not talking about the verb, the action. I'm talking about what it means to be male and female. That's very important in Catholic moral understanding. And also is the term friendship, right? Even Christ said, I call you friends. Even from the ancient Greeks, anybody ever reads the Nicomachean Ethics, the last 3 books are all about friendship. What does this friendship mean? All right? So actions of love and gift, and also our sexuality and our friendship. All these things are ways that that the world sees him in us.
What does it mean by we image God?
In other words, we as a people, the human people, all right? Because, he's not here. We know that he died and rose again, and he ascended into heaven. So then I can't see God except into you. This is why we have to be radical in our lives. If we wonder why people are not attracted to this faith, what was so easy to love about Mother Teresa? The woman was like this pure gift. It was almost like there was no ambiguity in her lives. But too many of us, we live the same lives as everybody else. You can't even distinguish us from other people. We take the same, extravagant vacations. We're still worried about having a really good retirement. We're going to join the same clubs. You can go on and on and on. And how do we recognize this person is different from that person? So anyway, we all work this out. It's all things that we try to work out through our life. Now, you know this phrase, right? But here's the deal. So the man goes to heaven, and Christ says, every time I was hungry, you fed me. Every time I was thirsty, you gave me drink. Every time I was tired, you gave me rest. When I was naked, you gave me clothes. When I was in prison, you came and visited me. And the man said, I've never seen you before. I would have done those things, but I've never seen you before. And Christ replies, every time you did it for anybody that was made in my image, you did it for me. Why? Because I am imaged in those people. So likewise, the man who then stood before the Father, and he said, every time I was naked, you never gave me your clothes. When I was thirsty, you gave me no water. When I was hungry, you gave me no food. When I was in prison, you never visited me. When I was tired, you never gave me rest. And the man said, surely I would have done these things if I had never seen you. And Christ then says the opposite. Every time you did not do these for the least of my brethren, you did not do them for me. This is not hard to understand, right? So sometimes we get worried about the parts in Scripture that are hard to interpret. This is not that hard to interpret. Live for other people and do it because they're made in His image. All right? We'll talk about that motivation here in a second. So man is to live the life of Christ in order to continue his mission on earth. His mission in the Spirit. Let's say it that way. Man is to live the life of Christ in order to continue his mission in the Spirit. Christ left. We image him. You guys do it now. Right? You guys do it. There's all sorts of Scripture that wrap around this, right? Like the man who left other people in charge of their field and their household, and he comes back and he finds them, not busy about what they should be, then he gets angry. So in other words, what is our mission? Our mission is to image him. Well, how do we image him? Doing all the things he already asked us to do. Put other people before ourselves. It totally wrapped in the gifts of love and virtue and sexuality and friendship. All right? Yes?
Can you repeat that, Shelley?
Yeah, sure. It had to do with we live the life of Christ to continue his mission in the Spirit. Okay, so that's God's plan for us. So then what should be our response? Okay, so in John 15:9 it reads, if you keep my commandments, you abide in my love. Anytime you have an if statement, it's propositional. In other words, it's conditional. If this, then that, right? So what happens if we don't keep his commandments? We don't abide in his love. Okay, now, here's something we got to start breaking of ourselves. I had a discussion online with a friend of mine that I grew up with that he has since left the Catholic Church, and he's kind of like an itinerant street preacher. And he says he doesn't like all the ritual, He didn't really come out and say it, but he doesn't like all the trappings and such. Well, they seem like rules. And this is what I've been trying to break with you guys, okay? Could you imagine if I told you, there's rules to being married. You have to be kind to your spouse. You have to be concerned about her well-being. You should look after her health, both mental, physical, and spiritual. You should help care for her. You should put her before you. These are all rules. Now, would you really, really see those as rules? I mean, if you went into a marriage relationship checking these things off, wouldn't that be kind of odd? But yet there are things you're supposed to do. That's what the commandments are. The commandments really are expressions that we are supposed to live. And if you look at them as rules, you've missed the whole boat. You've missed what the Catholic Church and Christ is trying to teach us. All right? So it's not a matter of simply making sure we keep the commandments. It's a matter of this is what love does. Love always reaches out to the other person. Okay? Now, this is very important. The first and last point of reference on morality is the person Jesus Christ. The first and last point of reference in morality is the person Jesus Christ. This is not about rules. This is about expressions of love. This is not about following the church. You're not going to fall in love with a doctrine. Nobody falls in love with a doctrine. You fall in love with people. Christ is a person. It's the love of the person, then, where you want to express that love, where the commandments become fulfilled. But the motivation's different, all right? And to understand that, well, I'll give it to you in a second. Let's do this first. The virtues that you live are formed, motivated, and saturated with love. We just have a poor understanding of love. Remember, I'm giving you, for the sake of our course, synonyms. Love, sacrifice, and gift. These are synonyms. If your love does not require constant sacrifice on your part, you're not there yet. If it is in total selflessness, if you aren't ready to get married and put aside every last goal you have for the sake of that person, don't get married. We don't need more statistics. Could you imagine if two people say, everything I do will be oriented towards you and what is good for you? And then that person says to you back, and I too will only do what's oriented towards you. Could you imagine, girls, if you met a guy, I'm a young man myself at one time. Can you imagine if we formed young men, and some have this charism, that they would rather lose their lives than diminish the virtue or the reputation of a young girl? Could you imagine if you met somebody like that? You'd latch on to them. You'd say, look, I know it's only high school, but I'm following you to college, I'm getting married. This is the one. I have never met somebody who will constantly put me first and more concerned with my virtue than they are anything else. That's not easy, right? It's not really capable without grace, whether we believe it or not. But anyway, it's motivated and saturated with love. So St. Basil, he says, what are our motivations for turning away from evil and towards God? That's conversion, by the way, right? And we have big conversions, we have little conversions. He said, first of all, if you're motivated to turn away from evil because you're afraid of punishment, in other words, I don't want to go to hell, it might get you where you want to go, but he says you're nothing more than a slave. Because slaves are concerned about being beat, about being punished. That's not the type of relationship God wants with us. Again, think in terms of marriage. Could you imagine that you are just complying with everything the other person does because you simply don't want to deal with the aggravation and the yelling? How long does that relationship last? Not long, right? St. Basil goes on to say, if you then would turn away from evil for the reward, I just want to go to heaven. That's my goal. I want to go to heaven. He says, you're nothing more than a mercenary. You're a soldier for hire. In other words, could you imagine in marriage if your only goal was to not get divorced? What's your goal? Well, I love her, but my goal is really not to get divorced. That's it. How long do you think that relationship will last? He then concludes, but in contrast, if you do it for love's sake, this is what sons and brothers, daughters and sisters do. All right? Now you're in. So what he wants is a motivation of love to carry out his son's mission. We carry out his son's mission in the lives. And everything we do, our virtues, our character, our motivations are all saturated with love. Remember, love is gift and sacrifice. And if sacrifice has to hurt, all right, you have to bring joy out of it, but sacrifice has to hurt. I am telling you the number of times that me and my wife have put our wants and dreams aside for something else. It is constant compromise, but when people say, I need to live my life, the minute you start thinking like that, you're already on the road out of that covenant. All right? Because that's not what we're in. Remember how Christ tried to restore the covenant and did so with his son? All that has to happen within our marriages. This is why marriage, again, this is why the Catholic Church is so definitive on what it means to be married, because it reflects something very, very particular. And other things lack that. We'll get into that another day. Okay? So anyway, that's our response. Now, in the last 14 minutes, let's look at a creation mythos. First, I want to differentiate, and this is really not strict definitions, but it's clearing it up for our class. Why don't I use the word myth? Like, if I were to speak about the book of Genesis and the creation stories, they're myths. If I started using that type of language, even if it might be true, you're going to hear it one way. I can't count on your connotations. So myth, the word is really associated with not being true, right? So if I use the word myth, you hear the word it's false. And that's why most theologians are not going to use that word, all right? Now, first of all, this wouldn't really matter if you're a creationist. If you literally think that, the entire world was formed in 6 days, 24-hour days, and that if oil and diamonds and and everything else were simply created by God and not, the result of millions of years of formation, Okay, none of this is going to matter to you anyway, because to you that's historical. Okay, but the church has no qualms with evolution. And by the way, let me just say as an aside, there is nothing you can say that science will discover that's going to discount anything the Catholic Church says. It's not possible. All right, these are simply two different truths. Not sorry, they're two different paths to one truth. So we're not really fearful about what might come out in the future. So anyway, a myth, if I use the word myth, you mentally hear it's once upon a time. So this is like a fairy tale, all right? Which are what some atheists mockingly call these stories in Genesis, out of ignorance. They don't understand what they are. Or if they do, they're battling fundamentalists who do think it's a six-day creation, okay? But if we have an opportunity to talk to them in this regard, it's going to change everything the way they see it. Because we're not, in other words, you can no longer call it a fairy tale, because we're going to say it's not a fairy tale. All right? And we're going to say this is why. So we use the word mythos in contrast because it loses that untrue connotation. All right? So what we got to do is reorient the way we're hearing this. It can lose an untrue connotation, and we'll talk a little later about what it might still be. But a mythos literally shapes the way that we understand ourselves, okay? This is a story about us. So the book of Genesis, in the end, will be a story about us as a people. It shapes the way we understand ourselves. It also speaks to the formation, the character, and the culture of us as a people. I mean, it's going to define who we are in many facets. So it's going to define us in terms of our culture and our character and who we are as a people. And lastly, it represents something true even if it's not historical. Okay? So we've got to understand the opposite of true for our sake, intents and purposes is false. It's not the opposite of true. I'm sorry, the opposite of true is not unhistorical, okay? So, we're just laying that out there. We can't spend more time on it, but... Now, has anybody ever heard of the Enuma Elish? Anybody ever heard that? Okay, it's an epic poem from ancient Babylonia. You don't need to write this down. But here's the first 9 lines. It was just found in the 19th century, by the way. Okay? Like in the mid to late 19th century. When in the height of heaven was not named, and the earth beneath did not yet bear a name, and the primeval Apsu who begot them, and Chaos, Tiamat, the mother of them both, their waters were mingled together, and no field was formed, no marsh was to be seen. If you lived in ancient Babylon, you're reading this like we read the book of Genesis. Alright? When of the gods none had been called into being, and none bore a name, and no destinies were ordained, then they were created, the gods in the midst of heaven. All right. So what that literally means when we say Enuma Elish, it literally means went on high. The ancient documents always just took the first phrase or words, and that's how they named the document. So Enuma Elish literally means went on high. Now, I'm not that interested in you get every last little tidbit about this. I need you to get the flavor of this and what's going on. On Friday, we're going to contrast this with our priestly Genesis mythos. So the universe was unformed and it contained only water. That's how their world view started. So they have these 2 gods. Apsu is the god of the fresh water. He's male. And Tiamat, who is the god of salt water. She's female and actually has like the body of a dragon. Salt water was always understood in terms of evil. That's where the evil existed. All right? So she's personified as a little more horrific than Apsu. All these lesser gods, there's a plethora of gods. They all formed as their children, but here's how it happened. When the salt water and the fresh water mixed, it formed silt, and from the silt, these lesser gods were formed. So all the gods of creation were their children that came from the union of these 2 gods, and it arose from the silt of their union. Okay? Now, think of Apsu and Tiamat as the gods of the water. All the other gods kind of live within them. Okay, so don't think of like a body and all these little tiny people inside. They live within them. my advice is when you're trying to understand these stories, just take it on their level. Don't try to dissect it. Try to understand it the way they understand it, and then you can critique it after that, right? The problem is Apsu couldn't take all the commotion. There was just too many king gods around. It was driving her nuts, all right? Him nuts, I should say. Now, there's something else in here that I didn't really put in here. There's other gods that come into play. This one god, Yu, he is a very powerful god. And see, Apsu and Chimu want to get rid of these other gods, right? Because I'm tired of all the noise. Got too many kids. So this powerful god, Yu, he actually puts Apsu to sleep, all right? So now it's just Chimu. We'll see in a minute here, Chimu kind of like has a new spouse. Yu takes on a spouse himself, and of their child is Marduk. Now Marduk is a very powerful god, and he'll play very prominent in the story. Marduk is the favorite child. He's such the favorite, he's actually given the winds to play with. Right? When you think you get cool Christmas gifts, he gets the winds. What happens when winds hit water? What happens? What's the wind's effect on water? Let's put it that way.
Waves.
Yes, and it's just more commotion. So now there's too many kids, and now you got Marduk really, stirring up the things, right? So what happens then is Chimu, the female god of salt water with the new husband Kingo, they're going to set out to destroy all these gods, right? Well, they really can't have it. I mean, the other gods don't want to be destroyed. So what they do is Marduk shows up, and that's Chimu and Kingo, by the way. So this is Chimu, the female god of salt water, the dragon, and here we have Kingo, the warrior god with the winged god. So Marduk says, look, I'll destroy them, but here's my deal. In the end, I'm the big guy. I get all the power. Well, they don't really think he can do it. They actually destroy part of a constellation and say, if you're so powerful, go and replace it. And he does it perfectly. And they're like, okay, guy's got a shot. So he sets out, right? So Marduk agrees, and he goes to destroy Chimu and Kingu, all right? So he's really after Chimu here. So there he is with his arrows and such, and he's going fighting the dragon god of the salt water, and he's successful. He destroys her. Now, what happens then is he takes the body of Chimu, and he rips it in half, and he has two spheres in his hands, and he places one sphere as the dome over the earth, and the other sphere he forms the formations of the earth, the mountains and such. So you're starting to hear like remnants, right, in even our Genesis story about the dome above and the dome below. He then takes the head of Chimu and buries it in the sand, and then with his spear, he drives it through the eyes, and from the eyes flow the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So if you're hearing this, what are you hearing? You're hearing this guy has control over all things. I mean, he has control. I mean, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers are pretty prominent in their culture, right? In their livelihood. So this guy controls them. This is the man. So again, this is their story. They're trying to determine who they are as a people. So Marduk then says, with all these gods, we're doing all the physical labor. We're tired of doing all the physical labor. So he commands the lesser gods, I want you to go and take the body of Chimu, whatever's left over, and the blood, and I want you to form human beings. And let's make them our slaves. That's what their story is. All right? The gods then build a city in Babylon. That's the drawing of the temple. And there's Marduk. And that's their story. So if you are a person living in Babylon, you understand this is how all things were formed. And I didn't give you everything else, how he formed. There's a lot there. But in the end, you're an afterthought. And you're created from the blood of a battle. And you're created for what purpose? To be a slave. Now, this is a really cool story if you're the king of Babylon. Because you're as high as it gets. Anybody else? Too bad. All right? Too bad. So what we're going to do then on Friday is we're going to take that story and then we're going to contrast it with the priestly creation mythos. and we're gonna see, does it develop two different worldviews, two different understandings of the human person, and two different understandings of love and mission, all right? That's it.